Hello, beautiful soul family. Rebecca here, your vibe mentor, bringing you another video on how to raise your vibration so you can live your best life. Let's talk today about boundaries. You know, sometimes we get to talk about the sexy topics, and sometimes we got to talk about the unsexy stuff, and boundaries is one of them. This topic has been, or at least the need for boundaries, has been coming up quite a bit in my coaching sessions, my daily life. I think it's always going to be an ongoing topic. So it's worth refreshing. If you have heard some of this information before, I guarantee you there's going to be something here that refreshes or reminds you of something that maybe you have forgotten. So, what are boundaries? How do we implement them? How do we spot when we are not upholding them? And how do we shift back into holding our boundaries after our loved ones or the people around us have gotten accustomed to our not having boundaries? And let me close that really quickly so we are not disturbed, because there's always more than one. All right, so boundaries, what are they? They are guidelines, rules, or limits that create a system or a network or a protection around not only ourselves to keep ourselves safe, but also sometimes to keep the others safe. They communicate what is safe and permissible for others and the way they treat us and the way they behave around us. It teaches people how to respond to us, and it creates sort of that limit that says that if you have stepped outside of my boundary, we're going to have to make some shifts and changes. Now, I don't want to say that there necessarily needs to be repercussions, but there are natural consequences to boundary crossing. And so by default, that is a bit of a repercussion. If someone chooses not to honor or respect the boundary, it's kind of like trespassing. This is the edge of my property. This is the edge of my emotional tolerance. And of course, it needs to be within reason. But if someone crosses that line, then there's going to be a natural consequence to that. Boundaries help us define where we end and where someone else begins. And part of the reason I'm doing this video now is because I've done a couple of videos recently on being or dealing with vampires as well as being codependent, and boundaries are a critical component in how to deal with energy vampires or how to heal our own codependency. So again, the boundary is designed to help us communicate, and how to communicate the ways we expect to be communicated with, the behaviors that we're willing to tolerate, and what interactions are acceptable. So sometimes boundaries will relate to self-care and self-respect. Sometimes it is to communicate your needs in a relationship. Sometimes it's to make space for positive interactions. Sometimes it's to set limits in a relationship in a positive and healthy way. It should keep us from stress, and I don't want to say should because I don't like to use that word, but boundaries will, when you use them, keep you from stress, depression, anxiety, and even illness or financial burden. That many times boundary crossers, people who are willing to take advantage, will end up hurting us knowingly or unknowingly, and because we allow that to happen, we are an equal participant in the engagement or the interaction. And so this is where we have to be firm in our boundaries. A lack of boundaries will affect our life. It will affect all aspects of our life. People who don't like boundaries are not good for you. Healthy people, people who are capable of healthy engagement and attachment, will respect and appreciate boundaries. If they don't respect or appreciate your boundaries, that should be considered a red flag, and limit contact immediately. Now, my general rule is three red flags. So I would give them an opportunity. I would express kindly. Check out the video on nonviolent communication, where we very gently reiterate, this is how this makes me feel. This is what I need in this engagement. I'm open to hearing what you need, and let's find a win-win. And if they are not willing to meet you in that place, if they criticize you, they say there's something wrong with you, you're crazy, you're over emotional, then there's something wrong with that dynamic, and it's unhealthy, and that should be considered enough of, that should be three red flags all right there, enough to walk away and limit contact. So when we don't keep our boundaries, or I'm sorry, reasons we do keep our boundaries is to prevent rejection. I'm sorry, I misread that. The reasons we don't keep our boundaries. I haven't read these notes in a bit. The reasons we do not keep our boundaries. Why are we porous in our boundaries? Why do we forego our boundaries? Why do we set up a boundary and then change our mind or become wishy-washy around it? It is because of the fear of rejection, the fear of abandonment, the fear of confrontation. Maybe guilt might come into the factor. It may be because we grew up in an environment where we were made to feel guilty a lot as a young child, where we didn't have boundaries for ourselves. Obviously, as children, that's very difficult to do, but also our parents did not have boundaries for themselves or for us. And then we were guilt tripped into behaving the way that they wanted us to behave. Maybe we were not taught how to have healthy boundaries. When we don't have parents who have healthy boundaries, we don't learn how to do that for ourselves. And then sometimes it may even just be through safety concerns, that if you're dealing with someone who is highly toxic or physically threatening, that we will sacrifice our boundaries to stay safe, right? Boundaries go both ways. They are both for us as well as the other in the relationship. We must uphold our boundaries for ourselves as well as in the relationship for the other. Porous boundary sends a message to the other that they can push our limits and break our boundaries anytime they want. So that's where the term, or not sure if that's where it comes from, but it applies here, is if you give them an inch, they will take a mile. So if you demonstrate that my boundary is porous or that I can be manipulated or convinced otherwise, then they will continue to do that, and it will amplify and increase. Inconsistently holding our boundaries for ourselves teaches us that we cannot trust us. And in a way, it is a form of self-abandonment. So if you've ever noticed, if you set a goal or you decided you were going to go to the gym 3 days a week and then you didn't do it, you start to lose respect and trust in yourself. And this is where it becomes very important not to overcommit to things, not set ourselves up for failure, but to keep those promises or renegotiate. If we discover that 3 is too much in a week, then let's say, okay, I understand that this is not healthy for me and I need to dial it back down to 2 days a week. But it's when we say, I'm going to go 3 days a week and then I don't go at all, there's no respect built within yourself for yourself. And that is a critical component in relating to yourself. At the same time, we don't want to be too rigid with our boundaries. We need to be flexible. Like I said, we need to have that freedom to renegotiate or evolve things. But there can be boundaries that are too rigid. We can be too porous. We can be too rigid. We have to be balanced, as with many things. So many times we can end up keeping people at a distance emotionally and physically because of rigid boundaries that are not considering the other. So an example of rigid boundaries would be avoiding intimacy. We won't ask for help. We have very few close friends. We're overprotective of ourselves or information about us. We're detached from personal and romantic partners, and we keep others at a distance. An example of porous boundaries would be oversharing, difficulty saying no to requests of others, over-involved in others' problems, dependent on others. Again, see that codependency video. Accepting of abuse or disrespect, fears of rejection if others do not comply. And that's also a form of control, also discussed in the codependency video. So what does a healthy boundary look like? I love to share with you what does good look like, because if we are going to strive to do things well, we have to understand what does good look like. So we would value our own opinion. We would also value the opinion of the other. We work to create that win-win scenario without too much compromise on either side. We don't compromise our values. So that's really critical in knowing what you stand for and what's really, really important to you. What's a non-negotiable? We do share personal information, but in an appropriate way, not too quickly, not too much all at once. We test the waters, we go slowly. We see if it's a safe and healthy relationship by moving slowly and gauging the response and engagements over time. And we accept the way that others say no and have boundaries for themselves. That just when I used the example earlier of someone not respecting your boundaries, we also have to reciprocate. So when someone says this is a boundary for me, or I need you to show up in this way, you have to kind of take a step back and ask yourself, does this violate my values? Is this something that I can compromise on? Am I able to meet them halfway without sacrificing who I am and what I have already established as my boundaries? And so then you can find a way to come together, or you can determine that this is not healthy for you and move on. So there are a few different types of boundaries. We need boundaries in many different areas of our lives. There can be intellectual boundaries that are thoughts and ideas. Sometimes it's about politics or the way we're spoken to. We should not be diminished or belittled. Sometimes they're emotional. When we share too much personal information, like I mentioned, we want to gradually reveal as opposed to immediately opening up and being, as they say, an open book, which, to be transparent, to be authentic is good, but to bear your entire life story the first time you meet someone, that's called oversharing. But still yet, we should not be criticized or belittled or invalidated. There are sexual boundaries. Emotional, intellectual, and physical all come into this. We should have a mutual understanding and respect of limitations and desires. We should never be violated by unwanted behavior, pressured to engage, or made comments about. If you have established a boundary and said, this is something that I'm not comfortable with, but that person continues to pressure you or to make fun of you, that is very serious boundary crossing. And that needs to be a very big red flag. There are also material boundaries, money and possessions. Lending should be reserved for people who are close to you that you trust. You don't just give yourself away to anyone. Stealing, damage, or pressure to give or lend is a violation of boundaries. If someone takes your things without asking, especially if you say, hey, that's mine, could you please not, and it's done again, maybe the first time it was an accident or they didn't know, but that is a serious violation. There is a subconscious knowing when someone is crossing an unspoken boundary. And if someone is not able to acknowledge that or tries to somehow confuse you or gaslight you that shouldn't be a problem, then that is a very serious red flag. There's also time boundaries, how time is used. Many of us have places to go, people to see, things to do, and we need people to respect our time. If they're late, if they take too much time, if they talk for the entire conversation for 30 minutes straight and don't give you space to speak or ask you if you actually have time to be on that call, then that should be a red flag. We must have boundaries and set aside enough time for each facet of our life, such as work and relationships and hobbies. Time boundaries that are violated when another person demands too much time from another person. Again, like I said, being late or just not considerate of your time. So here's how we set boundaries. Pretty simple, 4 easy steps. Number 1, we define what the boundary should be. So which bucket does it fall in? Is it a time boundary? Is it a material boundary? Is it a physical boundary? Is it a sexual boundary? Now, it can be difficult for people to identify what is it that I want when we have experienced a lot of complex trauma or we have forgone our needs for our entire life. So go easy on yourself. Start small with 1 or 2, but really look at those areas where you feel triggered, where you feel that someone has taken too much. If you feel anger or frustration, those actually are good emotions that are there to help you see that you have not been treated properly. Now, I'm not justifying going out and behaving angrily towards someone, certainly not being physically or verbally aggressive, but just notice that feeling of frustration or anger that wells up in you because it's designed to push you to make a change in that area. So look for areas where you feel frustrated, angered, or triggered. Those are areas where there's a boundary that needs to be set and it has been crossed. Now, I will say that carefully because a traumatized body and brain will over-exaggerate a trigger, but that still doesn't mean that it needs to be ignored or that you need to self-sacrifice in that situation. It is an indicator of an area where some change needs to happen, and this is where we can take the first step. We can say, I am not comfortable with your always being 30 to an hour late, 30 minutes to an hour or 2 hours. That is not acceptable in my life. And so if you are not going to be on time, I'm not going to wait. I will not be there if you are any more than 10 minutes late or 15 or whatever your boundary is. Natural repercussions happen when a boundary is crossed. You have no obligation to sit there and wait for that person. You should not determine your entire life or have to move and shift your entire day around this person. If they're not going to show up, go on about your day. Go do the things that you were going to do. And if they really need to catch up with you, they really need to pick up the kids, whatever it is, they'll find you. But you should not have to adapt and adopt their timeline. So number one is define the boundary. I have a time boundary. If you're not on time, I will not wait. Then we gently, kindly, respectfully, and lovingly communicate that boundary. And this is key because sometimes when we're so used to being passive and easygoing, it can kind of build up inside of us, and then we lash out with frustration. You're always late. I hate you. You're such a bad person, right? And that's not resourceful. That's not helpful. It's not kind. It's not necessary, and it will not accomplish the goal. So we need to very nicely say what I just said. I have a time boundary now. If you're any more than 15 minutes late, I will not be there. I will not be waiting. I'm going to go about my day, and you'll have to meet up with me when it is convenient for me, right? That is the communication. They're not going to like it, and they're likely going to respond aggressively, especially if you have if you've had porous boundaries up until this point. But the key is step 3 is keep it simple. Don't over-explain. Don't justify. Don't let them goat you into arguing about it, right? If they want to debate whether or not that's acceptable, sorry, I don't have time for that. I need to go, okay? Keep it simple and set the consequence and keep the consequence. Do not sit there and wait. Truly go on about your life. Okay, so set it clearly, set it calmly, set it fairly, set it respectfully, lovingly, in as few possible words. And do not justify, do not get angry, do not argue, do not debate, do not apologize for your boundary. No is a complete sentence. Remember that if someone says, "Can I be 30 minutes late?" No, we set this boundary. No, I will be at the grocery store if you'd like to find me there. Okay? You are not responsible for the other person's reaction. You are not responsible for their distaste of your boundary. You have a right. Your needs deserve to be met. You are the decider in your life. You are the authority in your life. You are a sovereign being, and you get to determine where those boundaries are. You are not responsible. I have to reiterate that you are not responsible for their reaction. Just because they get upset and they're uncomfortable and you're going to feel it, likely as a highly sensitive person or a highly empathic person, you are not responsible for how they react, okay? You are responsible for communicating in a calm and respectful manner. You are responsible for communicating the boundary from a safe and loving place. If it upsets them, that is a reflection of their inner work that needs to be addressed, their triggers, their traumas. That is not yours. Those who are accustomed to controlling, manipulating, and abusing will get upset. Just count on it. If they have been taking advantage of you or manipulating you, especially for a long period of time, you can count on the fact that they're going to get upset. Now, for me, that actually is very helpful. If I go into a conversation knowing there's going to be backlash, knowing that I'm going to be accused of being a bad person and called all the names in the book, it doesn't really matter to me anymore. Especially if I can foresee that coming and you're that predictable, it says everything about you and nothing about me. Okay? Plan on it, expect it, and reframe it. So go into it not justifying, but explaining to yourself that this is their trauma, this is their reaction, they're responsible for being late all the time. That's not my responsibility to solve that problem for them. Apologizing sends mixed messages, so do not apologize. You do not apologize for your boundary. You do not apologize for their response. You do not apologize for the inconvenience that they create you by always being late. This is not yours. So be careful in general in life. How often are you apologizing? Because many times, most of us who have experienced trauma or have been codependent or overgiven, that we're apologizing too much. And so we need to really reserve that for the times when it really is critically important. And then just go easy on yourself. Know that it's going to take practice. Know that you're not going to go from 0 to 60. You're not going to have no boundaries one day and then all the boundaries the next day. You're not going to be able to fully and firmly stand up for those boundaries every single time that you want to, or I'll use the word should here. but you will get used to it over time. It is a muscle. It gets so much easier. And over time, it's just like building the dendrites or the neural pathways in the brain. You will very quickly come to a place of doing it effortlessly. It will just click. It will just happen, and you won't even have to think about it. It's kind of like a brick wall that's just there all the time, and I don't think about it anymore. Of course, I'm not going to tolerate someone behaving that way. Of course, you're not allowed in my life if you're going to be that kind of person. Of course, I'm not going to sit here and wait for you for 30 minutes to an hour beyond the time that we agreed to. It's just not a question. Okay? So set a goal to develop a support network of people who respect your boundaries. Find a friend, find a coach, find someone that you can trust and rely on to sit with and discuss this with so that you can get that mirror or that sounding board that says, yes, this is a firm and healthy boundary. It's fair. You're not being unreasonable. And you'll have that extra support. You'll feel like you have somebody behind you. Somebody's got your back when you go into that and you set that boundary with a person who needs it. Okay? All right. I love you guys. I will see you on the next video. Please do make sure you like, subscribe, and share. This button will subscribe so you get notified of the next videos. Otherwise, this one is chosen just for you. All right. Take care, my friends. I love you. Bye-bye.